We are in the book of Esther, so you can go ahead and turn to Esther chapter 2. Esther chapter 2, and we'll pick up there in just a second. You'll remember what's been happening in the book of Esther. The king was showing off his kingdom, and he asked his queen to come before him in a very provocative way, before all of those other individuals of his kingdom were there. And he asked her to do something that no husband should ever ask his wife or his queen to do, and she refused. And he took some ill advice. One of his subjects in his kingdom said, she's really ruined it for all of us men. She's really showing every woman that she can make a decision. You've got to put this to punishment. Banish her by law. And in his drunken stupor, he banished her by law. And you'll remember as we started last week, he recognized in chapter 2, verse 1, he remembered who she was. He remembered what he had done. And he was left in sorrows. And so far in chapter 2, the idea has come up again. It's one of his other people inside of his kingdom under his power says, you need to find you, let us bring all the beautiful women in. And you find you a wife. And you'll remember we were introduced to Esther. She's been brought in. We've been introduced, at least in our discussions, to Mordecai. He's involved in this process. And all these ladies have been brought in. Esther's been given favor into the hand of the keeper of the ladies who are going to be selected for the king. And she's been given the goodly things as we finished up in verse 11. And verse 12 picks us up in where we're going to start today. And look at verse 12. Now when every maid's turn was come to go into King Ahasuerus, after that she had been 12 months, according to the manner of the women, for so were the days of their purification accomplished, to wit, 6 months with oil of myrrh, 6 months with sweet odors, and with other things for purifying of the women. How long has Esther been away from her people? At least a year. That's the best way. You can't get too specific in your looking at these type of dates, and really the specifics of that date doesn't matter, but here's the illustration. She's been away from her people about a year. Now pause yourself for just a moment. Whether you wanted to go or you didn't want to go, if you were queen, or let me rephrase, if you were Esther, we know she's going to be queen. I always want to call her Queen Esther. If you were Esther and you've been away from your family for a year, remember your parents had already died and Mordecai had been taking care of you as if you were his daughter. He's been checking on you what seemingly to be daily in the context of this. He's going to the court to see what's happened to her. It's been a year. What would your attitude be? You couldn't leave and go see anybody. You couldn't go out and see anybody you knew. You've been with these strange 7 ladies who've been helping you purify yourself to meet before the king. What would your attitude be? Would you be happy about being gone from your family for a year? Miserable might be a good definition. Very well could be, but read down with me down to verse 14. Then thus came every maiden unto the king, whatsoever she desired was given to her, to go with her out of the house of the women into the king's house. In the evening she went, and on the morrow she returned in the second house of the women to the custody of the man who was over them, the king's chamberlain, which kept the concubines. She came unto the king, and no more, except the king delighted in her, and that she was called by name. She's also not only been away from her family for a year, but she's knowing she's getting ready to go in this process, and the only way she can go before the king is if he knows her and calls her by name. How's that sound? Sounds a little difficult, doesn't it?
Esther was willing to sacrifice.
That's right. That's right. There are a lot of things bigger happening in this particular scene, and I would suggest us to learn this lesson. And I think it's a lesson that people as a whole have lost. But we need to start recognizing that there are things that we can do and they may hurt, but we can help our people. And it's very simple things for us. No, we're not asking you to become the queen of a community or a queen of a nation. But can't we all sacrifice to live the Christian life? I don't think that's a far drawn away application here. Is our world sometimes unbearable towards Christians? What's the worldview toward the Christian? Not much. That means that's the worldview toward you and toward me. What is our reasonable service? What's our reasonable service? Remember Romans 12, 1 and 2? What's our reasonable service? To live for Christ. That's a very good illustration of that. Fear God and keep His commandments. Our world, whether we like this or not, it's different, isn't it? And it's going to get different every day, isn't it? And unless our world lives by the laws of God, it's going to get really different, isn't it? That's right. That's right. Things are changing. Now, I'm not going to say for the better or for the worse. Things are different, aren't they? Has the Christian's attitude, the Christian's life changed any? No. What's our end goal? What's our goal here? Go to heaven. And the reality of all of these things, it doesn't matter what happens in this world. We sometimes are so stuck by it that we're so concerned about it. But I'm going to tell you this, I'm going to try to go to heaven as much as I can, whether this nation's a Christian nation or not. What about you?
I read a story not too long ago where in the 5th century where a man built a tower and lived up on top of it to get out of this world.
That's right. That's right. That's happened numerous occasions inside of the world's history. People try to get out of this world, try to get away from the crazy, and all they do is become the crazy. We can't do that either. You know, we could build a compound and all of us live there, but what would still be there? What would still be there? Sin, temptation. Let's not act like we're any bit different from the world. We're just marching toward a different end goal. Now, we live differently than the world. Don't get me wrong in that. Her position was different than she ever imagined it. It was changing. It was volatile.
You can't get out of this world.
That's right. You can't get out of this world, and neither could she. And there's one of two things that's going to take place in this life for us. What are those two things? There's one thing that's in your control, and it's going to lead you down one or two directions. You're dead on with me. You can go with the world or go with Christ, and that's going to affect our attitude. I don't always like what this world does. I'd be confident Esther did not always like what her world was doing to her either. Would you think that? I would. Even if she recognized she could help her people, which I think she's going to value as this plays out. Yeah, it can. It can easily do that. Think about it. She's alienated from her people. The only way Mordecai's finding out is he goes to the court of the king's temple or the king's area just trying to get information. She can't go. She can't call. She can't text. She can't email.
Herodotus wrote that the king was supposed to collect a coin from the foremost Persian families.
Yep.
So if Esther had made known to the king that she was a Jew,
It would have destroyed everything that was getting ready to take place. Now look at verse 15. This is interesting. Now when the turn of Esther, here's Esther. Imagine you've been here a year and you're waiting on your turn now. Now when the turn of Esther, the daughter, and here we get the information here, the uncle of Mordecai, who had taken her for his daughter, was come to go in to the king, she required nothing, but when Haggai, the king's chamberlain, the keeper of the women appointed, and Esther obtained favor in the sight of all of them that looked upon her. So Esther was taken into the king Ahasuerus, into the house royal in the 10th month, which is the year Tebeth and the 7th year of his reign. And the king loved Esther above all the women, and she obtained grace and favor in his sight more than all the virgins. So that he set the royal crown upon her head and made her queen instead of Vashti. That didn't take long, did it? How long did that take? Don't really know, do we? But it seemed it was pretty quick, didn't it? What did Esther do that was different than all the other ladies who had went into the king? This is before she ever got into his presence. What did she do different than all the other women did? You remember all the other ladies, and all the ladies were given an option to pick something that they could be given involved in this process. What did Esther ask for? She ended up getting favor from everybody, but what did she ask the keeper of the women for? Nothing. Isn't that interesting? All these other women were asking for material possessions. What's Esther asked for? Nothing. I find that significantly different about her character. All the others seem to be looking for what they could receive and what they could get. And isn't that how our world lives today? We live in the give me society. I call it Burger King mentality. Have it your way. You know, they used to have that slogan. They don't do that anymore. But that used to be their way, and that's how we live. I'm going to have it my way. You're going to have it your way. And that's how we're trained to live by the world. And all these other ladies, you can get this, but Esther says, I don't need this. She recognized the difference, at least to me she did. She didn't ask anything, and she, by doing this, obtained favor in the sight of all of them that looked upon her. It wasn't just her outward beauty that was recognized by those in the king's court. It was her inward beauty.
We don't usually think of those that were not selected, but true injustice occurs when one human abuses the lives of others to satisfy his desires.
That's right, and that's happening here. That's happening in this scene. And probably, I would highly guess that we've probably never studied the book of Esther and asked the question, what happened to the other women? What happened to them? They were concubines in the king's court. Yeah, in his harem. Yeah. We know verse 17 says, and the king loved Esther. Now notice this, above all the other women. It seems he had some desire to them too, but there's something different about Esther. And I have to tell you, I can't answer that question. Could he love her? The text says he loved her. And that's where I'm going to leave it. I do question any man's judgment who goes after more than one woman. Were there other individuals in Scripture who did this? Who was the wisest man of Scripture?
The whole Old Testament.
Yeah, a lot of the Old Testament. Even the wisest man of this world, what was his problem? Women. Yes. Yeah. Many times we see that, and this is another one of those occasions where we're seeing it happen. But something was different about Esther, which I think tells us something about, at least should tell us something about marriage.
Even though God is not mentioned, he had something to do.
That's right, he has something to do with this. I think we need to look at what's happening here. Now, don't hear me wrong with what I'm getting ready to say. But this king recognized something completely different about Esther than he did any other woman inside of his kingdom. And I think that should tell us something about marriage. Every man should recognize something different about his spouse. And that should hold true. And it seems that the king here is seeing something different. And I love what happens in verse 16. Into the house royal. Listen to the way his house is described. It's the house royal. And the queen or the proposed queens are being brought before him in the house royal, and he sees something different about Esther, and he makes her his queen. Look at verse 18. This will settle it for us. Now notice this. And made her queen instead of Vashti. What happens to Vashti from this point on? What happens to her? She wasn't put to death. Banished from the king's presence. We don't think about that very often. Verse 18, then the king made a great feast unto all his princes and his servants, and even Esther's feast, and he made a release to the provinces and gave gifts according to the states, or the state of the king. Now pause with me in verse 18. What got the king in all this trouble in the first place? What got the king in all this trouble in the first place? Too much wine. He threw a big party. What's happening in verse 18? What got him in trouble in the first place? He threw a big party. What's happening when he finds something that he loves and he likes? He lets everybody know it in grand fashion. He throws a big feast, a big party. He has a little ego problem, that's right. You'll remember as we looked in the book of Ruth, we often looked at Ruth and all of the individuals involved there. In Esther, we're going to be looking at Esther, but we're also going to be looking at the king here. He had an ego problem. And anytime something good in his life came up, he threw a gigantic party. And I love what's happened here. Not only does he throw a party, but he sends gifts according to his state throughout all the kingdom. It's another play of his wealth, isn't it? It's another play of his wealth. Even Esther here has her feast, just as in the beginning, as it started with Vashti. Vashti was holding her feast, remember? Now here Esther has another feast to begin. But pick up with me in verse 19. Let's introduce ourselves to Mordecai in the official scenes of this. And when the virgins were gathered together the second time, then Mordecai sat in the king's gate. Who's Mordecai, remember? Esther's uncle. Esther had not yet showed her kindred nor her people as Mordecai had charged her, for Esther did the commandment of Mordecai, like as when she was brought up with him. Now, Mordecai said he raised Esther as if she was one of his. And it's obvious, I think, at this point in verses 19 and 20, that Esther was raised by Mordecai as if he was hers. Does that make sense? As if he were her father. She knew about her father. I don't think there's any indication that thought that she was in the dark on that scenario. Esther recognized authority. And I want to suggest to you that the recognition of authority begins at home. The recognition of authority begins at home. Do we have an authority problem in this country? Anybody want to deny that? Everybody's got to be in control. Everybody's got to have the ego. Remember the king, he threw this great feast. Everybody's got to have the voice. Mordecai raised her to respect authority.
How does God's view of ego when he sees man's style of ego?
Well, God tells us he resists the proud. I would suggest that's the definition of ego, proud. He was so proud of himself, he showed everybody what he had. He was so proud of himself, he threw a feast for everybody. He was so proud of himself, he gave everybody a gift because he had a new queen. If that's not pride, I'm not quite sure what it is. Stuck up, that's another good definition for it. He was so important to himself, he had to show everybody else how important he was. And God resists the proud. Humility is a characteristic of God's people. But I think also respecting authority is a characteristic of God's people. The book of Romans teaches us that we're supposed to respect our government, doesn't it? Obey the magistrates. Even Jesus says, render to Caesar the things that be Caesar's. We're supposed to respect our government. They're God's minister for justice, isn't that right? Now, that's not a blanket statement to say that the government's always going to get it right. Does our government always get it right? No, and I'm displeased when they're wrong. But I will uphold respect to that office, won't you? Because the book of Romans teaches us it's ordained of God. I would suggest to you the same thing is happening here, this kingdom. We don't see the name of God, but I think we see it inside of this kingdom. I think we see it inside of Esther and Mordecai. And here, Mordecai has taught respect, and it's being shown forth. So Esther now is the queen. Mordecai sits at the gate. And it's interesting to see Mordecai in verse 21. In those days, while Mordecai sat in the king's gate, two of the king's chamberlains, and we get their names, those that kept the door, were wroth and sought to lay hands on the king. What's happening in verse 21? Two of the kings What were they? What was their job, these two men? Some type of service. Yeah, they would have been eunuchs, but it's interesting. Of those that kept the door, the doorman. You might want to call them this way, the gatekeepers. I won't limit it to a physical door to a building. Maybe this was a gatekeeper style. But they were doorkeepers, they were doormen, they were gatekeepers. You could call them this way, security. Security. And they were angry. You ever been angry? You too? Yeah.
How about it says furious?
I think it's more than just anger, don't you? I think this is anger with malice. This is intent. They were wroth and sought to lay hands on the king, and the king was known to Mordecai, who told it unto Esther. And the thing was known to Mordecai, who told it unto Esther the queen, and Esther certified the king thereof Mordecai's name. What's happening? Mordecai is saving who? The king. Now, let me ask you this question, because this is a discussion in our society now. Is the king a righteous man? No, he has a lot of problems, and I think that's evident in his life. This king is not a righteous man. Was Mordecai a righteous man? By all understandings, the answer is yes. Now, you're just like me. I don't have the inward workings of his life, his motives, his thoughts. But what has Mordecai heard? A plot to kill someone. What does Mordecai do? He saves a life. Does an unrighteous king deserve life? Does an unrighteous king deserve life? The answer is yes. The answer is yes. There's not a person on this earth, understand what I'm getting ready to say, who deserves the devaluation of life. Now, understand what I'm not saying. Can a government punish people with death? Yes. Is that unmotivated though? No. Here these two individuals were just mad at the king, and they sought to lay their hands on his neck. They were raw, they were angry with malice. They were going to kill him. Why did Mordecai tell Esther? Why did she tell Esther? He's not a righteous man. Our world would recognize it this way. Our world would justify it this way. He doesn't deserve to be our king. That's right. That's right. I believe this is a great illustration to us. No matter who it is, life deserves to be upheld. Life deserves to be upheld. That's right. That's right. There's opportunity here, and Mordecai sees that. So he gives the information to where it needs to go. She gets it to the king. She certifies his name before the king, and that tells me something interesting. Remember when the king was in his drunken state and one of his servants came to him and said, "Why don't you get rid of Vashti?" What did he do? Okay. Chapter 2, verse 1, he's in a state of sorrow, and following that context, one of his servants, his subjects, comes to him, "Why don't you bring all the beautiful ladies in and you pick you a new king?" What's he do? Okay. Queen Esther comes to the king and says, "King, your life's in danger," and she has to certify the name of Mordecai. Isn't that interesting to you? His own subjects, those in his own kingdom, okay, your life's getting ready to be taken, and she has to certify the word of Mordecai. Isn't that interesting to you? It is to me. Verse 23, and when the inquisition was made of the matter, it was found out, therefore they were both hanged on a tree, and it was written in the book of the Chronicles of the king. Keep this in mind. Remember chapter 2, verse 23, because we're going to come back to this passage in a future date. But we'll move on into chapter 3, because we need to meet a new man, a man named Haman, another man who had a problem with pride. Verse 1 and 2, after these things did King Ahasuerus promote Haman And we see his father's name and advance him and set him in his seat above all the princes that were with him. And all the king's servants that were in the king's gate bowed and reverenced Haman, for the king had so commanded concerning him. But Mordecai bowed not, nor did him reverence. We usually see the negative side of Haman, don't we? We only see him as the man who wanted to kill Mordecai, the man who wanted to kill God's people. Was he always that way? Was he always that way? I would suggest this is what we know about Haman. He was a hard worker, and it was recognized by the king. And above all the princes and other magistrates in the area, the king saw fit to put Haman above them all. That tells me something, doesn't it, you? He was good at his profession. But what became the downfall of Haman? What was his downfall? Was it that he was good at his job? Well, that wasn't the problem, was it? What was the problem? What was Haman's problem? Oh, ego, oh king, I'll throw a big party. Haman says, you'll bow down to me. Now, it seems, at least to a degree, that the king had commanded these things, verse 1 and 2. So I won't place all the blame on Haman, because sometimes the situations we find ourselves in create certain attitudes among ourselves, doesn't it? Someone gets lifted up enough, usually they end up with a problem of pride, or someone gets put down so much, usually they end up with a problem of resentment. That's an issue of life that we have to navigate. And here, he's going to take a navigational turn, especially looking at the end of verse 2. But Mordecai bowed not, nor did him reverence. What was wrong with bowing down before another human being? What was wrong with that? Is there anything wrong with that?
It's been that way from the beginning.
Been that way from the beginning. Who do we owe our reverence to? God. See, the thing we don't put into context, you may be sitting there thinking, but what's so wrong with bowing in homage to him? This was not just a gesture of thank you or a respect. You know, certain cultures bow in respect. Different idea than what's happening here. You see, most of the occasions in this kingdom, once you got so far up, even King Ahasuerus, he was a god. And evidently someone here had a god complex. You're going to bow down to me. Mordecai wouldn't bow down to him. It's going to drive him to his death because of what's happening. God told God's people, and God has told all people, that you will not reverence man as you reverence me. That's a statement. Now notice verse 3. Let's see what happens. Let's get the context. Then the king's servants which were in the king's gate said unto Mordecai, why transgresseth thou the king's commandments? Pause, don't go to verse 4. Those that were around Mordecai, you're going to get yourself killed. Why are you doing this? Does a nation or a king or a group of lawmakers or a president or anyone else, can they put God's people in a position where they have to choose who they're going to obey? Yeah, this king did. Verse 3 firms it up for us. At first, we had the idea at the end of verse 1 and 2 that Haman maybe didn't specify that people were going to bow down to him. But verse 3 tells us this is the king's commandment. You're supposed to be doing this, and why are you not doing this? Look at verse 4. Just the first two phrases. Now, when it came to pass, phrase 1, when they spoke daily unto him. How many days is this happening? Every day. Every day Mordecai comes into the king's court, and every day when Haman comes into the king's court, what is Mordecai doing? Everybody else is bowing down. What's Mordecai doing? He's standing up. Now, this is literally an occasion where someone had to take a stand, literally, but both figuratively as well. He could not bow down to the presence of men. Mordecai's associates have come to him daily. Why are you doing this? Why are you transgressing the king's law? Why are you doing this? Now look at the next phrase. And he hearkened not unto them, that they told Haman to see whether Mordecai's matters would stand, for he had told them that he was a Jew. So what do you think Mordecai told his fellow people in the king's gate? Well, they knew he was a Jew. What does that mean? For he had told them that he was a Jew. What had God told his people? Let's go back to the 10 Commandments. What had God told his people?
Worship him, not idols. Don't worship man.
Thou shalt have no other God before me. You think that was a problem for Mordecai? Oh, it was a problem for Mordecai, wasn't it? But he didn't let it be a problem in his life. You see, this book also teaches us, number one, that we may be put into terrible situations, which was Esther, and is also Mordecai. It also teaches us, just like Mordecai in the end of chapter 1, that when something needs to be said, we need to be the people that stand up and say it. Mordecai saved a man's life. It doesn't matter who he is, what he had done. Life has value. But here, we learn that we may be put into positions where we have to choose our God. And I'm going to say it in American terms. Where we have to choose our God or our president. I've asked this question before of this group. What's going to happen when we get here and there's a sign on the door? You can't worship here anymore, and there's the law code. What are we going to do? Mordecai could have just bowed down in reverence. He could have. Wasn't that an option for Mordecai? Sure was. He could have bowed down to that man. But what would he have done if he bowed down to that man?
Violate God's law.
He would have turned his back on the Almighty God. And there's the problem that we may face ourselves one day. I pray that that never happens. But I understand something. If we're never prepared for it, we won't be prepared for it. I pray that that occasion never happens, don't you? Every day, that's one of my prayers.
But what if it does?
Then we stand with God. I find that to be a simple statement, don't you? It's hard in its application. It's hard in its application. But we'll have to do what we have to do to stand with the Almighty God.
And all the other denominations, religions, have got forced to do the same thing.
Where most people will bow down to man, God's people will stand with God. Let me ask you this question. It's where we're going to end. Mordecai understood something about these people. He understood that their law, it meant business. Their law meant business. I believe Mordecai understood that he was facing his death. But let me ask you a surreal question. Will we face our death to obey our God?
It could come to that.
Now, I pray that that never takes place. I think that's a wild oddity in our world. But disobeying the king meant you were put to death by the law of the Medes and Persians. We might ask it this way: would we serve jail time for obeying our God? It may come to it. I pray that it doesn't. But will we be a Mordecai in a land of egos?
How many other nations around the world today has that no religion feeling?
I don't know.
Communist countries never believed in God.
I don't know.
Forced to.
This I know. We will not bow down to man. And that's where we're going to lead the class today. Be reading into this chapter, into the rest of chapter 3. We'll pick up here next Sunday. And keep it in your mind. We're blessed where we live. Thank you.